Hello, hello, and welcome back to Something to Noodle On. I'm your host, Mac, an average 30-something exploring the complex questions that keep us awake at night. Lately, I've been thinking about when you have a strong opinion about something, and then realized you weren't totally sure where that opinion even came from. Not that you didn't believe it, because you did. You might have even defended it. But if someone asked, okay, how did you learn that? The answer might be, I saw it, or I heard about it, or even everyone knows that. And that thought right there is what I want to talk about today. How much of what we believe is something we carefully thought through, and how much of it was shaped for us. Because whether we mean to or not, most of us form opinions about events we never personally witnessed. We absorb a version of the story we saw on social media or the news, and that version became our truth. So let's talk about the media, including journalists, social media influencers, and podcasters, and how much influence it really has over the way we think. Way back in 1994, long before social media was even a fraction of an idea, a woman sued McDonald's after spilling hot coffee on herself. Most of us probably think we already know this story. It's the old hot coffee lawsuit, right? The one that gets brought up anytime someone wants to complain about people suing over ridiculous things. The one that became shorthand for "this is why we can't have nice things." That's the version many of us absorbed, but when we slow down and actually look at what happened, the story becomes a lot harder to laugh at. The woman involved, Stella Liebeck, was 79 years old. She wasn't speeding down the highway with a cup balanced between her knees. The car was parked. She was sitting in the passenger seat, trying to take the lid off so she could add cream and sugar, when the coffee spilled into her lap. And the coffee wasn't just hot in the way we expect coffee to be hot. It was served at temperatures between 180 and 190 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough that medical experts testified it could cause third-degree burns in just a few seconds. To give you some perspective, Starbucks generally serves their coffee anywhere between 150 and 170 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the drink. Liebeck suffered severe burns over a significant portion of her body. She was hospitalized for over a week. She underwent skin grafts, and recovery was not quick or simple. She initially asked the company for $20,000 to cover her medical expenses. It wasn't some immediate, dramatic grab for millions. The larger number she was awarded came later, after a jury decided punitive damages were warranted. Jurors awarded her around $2.8 million, though a judge reduced that down to $640,000. McDonald's initial counteroffer? A meager $800. But somehow, none of that became the cultural memory. What stuck was the simplified version. Woman spills coffee, sues because it's hot. And we went with it. We repeated it. We referenced it. Some of us probably still feel that reflexive eye roll when we hear about it. How could it be anyone's fault but the lady's own? But in truth, McDonald's had received hundreds of prior complaints about burn injuries related to the temperature of their coffee. Internal documents showed they knew the coffee was being served at temperatures capable of causing serious harm. So when disaster finally did happen, instead of taking the blame, they leveraged the power of the media to shift our perspective on it. They hired a PR team to engage with media outlets, to feed us a story that was deemed a frivolous lawsuit, a matter of common sense and personal responsibility. And because most of us weren't in that parking lot where it happened, and we weren't in that courtroom where the facts came out, we received a specifically crafted version of the story. One that was shorter, cleaner, easier to digest, and that version shaped how we felt about it. Not because we're incapable of critical thinking or because we don't care about the truth, but because we rely on summaries, news framing, and social media clips with commentary from people who know far more than we do to bring us stories from around the world. And once a story is packaged a certain way, especially if it's repeated enough times, it can become almost impossible to separate the facts from the narrative that surrounds them. So if something as specific and documentable as a court case can be remembered so differently from how it actually unfolded, what does that say about how the rest of our opinions are formed? So after looking at something like the McDonald's case, it's tempting to jump straight to, see, the media just manipulates us. But that feels a little too easy, doesn't it? The truth is, most of us don't wake up every morning suspicious of everything we read. We check the weather on our phones, we glance at headlines before work, we follow major events as they unfold. Media isn't some distant, abstract force. It's part of our daily routine. It's how we stay connected to what's happening beyond our own living rooms. And if we rely on it that much, there must be a reason. We don't just trust something randomly. We trust it because on some level, it feels credible. It feels structured. It feels like someone has done the work of gathering information so we don't have to. So maybe instead of asking why we're so easily influenced, we should ask why it feels so reasonable to trust what we're shown in the first place. There's something about presentation that makes information feel solid. When we see a professional news set, polished graphics, a confident anchor speaking clearly and directly into the camera, it sends a subtle signal that this is organized, vetted, and reliable. Even outside of traditional news, that same feeling shows up in other ways. A verified account, a large following, high production quality, all of those cues suggest that the person speaking knows what they're talking about. And most of the time, that's not irrational. Journalists are trained. Editors exist. There are standards in place at many outlets. Real research happens behind the scenes. But here's something else to consider. We don't just absorb the information, we absorb the tone. If the person delivering the story sounds certain, we tend to feel certain. If they sound amused or dismissive, we might subconsciously adopt that posture too. If they treat something as obviously outrageous, we're nudged towards outrage without even realizing it. Confidence is persuasive. In everyday life, confidence often signals competence. If we go to a doctor who hesitates and seems unsure, we don't feel reassured. But if they speak clearly and decisively, we relax. We equate steady delivery with credibility. The tricky part is that sometimes what's being delivered isn't just raw information. It's someone's interpretation of the events at hand. And when interpretation is presented with authority, it can feel indistinguishable from fact. So part of why we trust the media is simply because it looks and sounds trustworthy. And that makes sense. But it also means how information is presented and delivered carries more weight than we might realize. Think about how ideas spread now. We don't just hear a story once. We see it in a headline, then again in a clip, then in someone's commentary about the clip, then in memes reinforcing the commentary. Before we know it, that narrative feels settled, like everyone agrees, and the conclusion has already been reached. That's exactly what happened with the McDonald's case. The simplified version was repeated so often that it became cultural shorthand. Most of us never felt the need to question it because it sounded familiar, and familiarity feels like consensus. This happens in smaller ways all the time. If we scroll past multiple posts saying a particular policy is a disaster, or that a public figure is obviously corrupt, or that everyone is furious about something, it starts to feel like the emotional tone has already been decided for us. Repetition creates comfort, and comfort feels like truth. And we like our truths to be easily digestible. Our brains are wired to conserve energy. When something sounds new or contradictory, we pause and analyze. But when something sounds like we've heard it before, we move on more quickly. It slides into place without much resistance on our end. That doesn't mean repetition is always deceptive. Sometimes repetition signifies widespread agreement. Music, films, and books become popular because everyone agrees that they're awesome, right? But sometimes repetition simply reflects amplification of an idea, and amplification doesn't necessarily equal completeness. When an idea echoes loudly enough, it can crowd out the quieter details that might complete the story or present the whole picture. And if it makes enough of an impression, we're likely to skip any further research and just take everything at face value. If we're being honest, a big part of why we trust the media is because it's practical. There is more information available now than any generation before us has ever had to process. We could spend every waking hour researching and still not cover everything. So we rely on summaries and experts and curated feeds that show us what's supposedly most important, or what may be of more interest to us. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Society depends on specialization. We trust mechanics to fix our cars and surgeons to perform operations. In the same way, we trust journalists and commentators to gather and present information. The problem isn't that we rely on summaries. The problem is that summaries are, by definition, condensed. They can't include every piece of context or show every angle. They highlight what fits and trim what doesn't. When information is compressed to fit a headline, a segment, or a short video, the most emotionally compelling pieces tend to survive the cut. And the details that slow the story down, the ones that require patience, reflection, or deep understanding, often get squeezed out. And once we've formed an opinion based on that condensed version, it can feel uncomfortable to revisit it, especially if we've already shared it, commented on it, or built part of our identity around it. At the end of the day, people don't like being proven wrong. This isn't about calling ourselves gullible or even too trusting. It's about acknowledging that we live in an environment where outsourcing our attention is almost unavoidable. When the attention is outsourced, we also hand over a bit of influence, letting other people decide what's important enough for us to notice or care about. Not because they force us, but because it's an efficient way to cut through all the available information. So if we can agree that media influence doesn't usually look dramatic or sinister, if it often shows up through authority, repetition, and convenience, then the next question feels almost inevitable. Is it even possible for the media to be completely neutral? Because sometimes when we talk about bias, it sounds like we're accusing someone of intentionally twisting the truth. And while that certainly happens in some cases, bias doesn't always arrive wearing a villain costume. Sometimes it shows up in much subtler ways. When we say we want unbiased reporting, what are we actually asking for? Are we asking for pure facts without interpretation? Are we asking for equal airtime for every perspective? Or are we asking for reporters who somehow have no personal history, no worldview, and no assumptions influencing how they see events? Because when you really think about it, the moment someone chooses which story to cover in the first place, a decision has already been made. Out of thousands of events happening on any given day, only a handful make it to the front page or the evening broadcast. That selection process alone shapes what we consider important. And importance influences perception. If we hear about one issue every day for a week, we naturally assume it's urgent. If something equally significant receives little coverage, it can feel more minor, even if it isn't. So maybe instead of asking whether bias exists, we should ask what form it takes. Let's go back to the McDonald's case for a moment. There are multiple accurate ways to describe that story. You could say, a woman spilled hot coffee on herself and sued. That statement isn't technically false. But you could also say, a corporation served coffee at temperatures known to cause severe burns and had received prior complaints. That's also true. Both descriptions are rooted in fact, but they guide us toward very different emotional reactions. That's called framing. The words chosen, the order of information, The emphasis placed on certain details, all of it gently steers us. Even something as small as a headline can tilt perception. Calling someone a protester creates a different impression than calling them a rioter. Describing a decision as a mistake feels different than describing it as negligence. And this doesn't only happen in major political events. Think about how stories spread on social media. A short clip circulates showing a person yelling. Without context, it looks explosive. Later, we might learn that the clip started mid-conversation after hours of discussion. The framing wasn't necessarily false, it just wasn't complete. But most of us react before we even see the longer version. And if we're being honest with ourselves, do people even have the attention span for the longer version? Framing matters because we are meaning-making creatures. We don't just collect facts, we interpret them. And the way information is presented can subtly influence the interpretation we land on. Even when journalists strive to be fair, they still have to decide what goes in the headline, what leads the story, and what gets mentioned briefly at the end. Those choices shape understanding whether anyone intends them to or not. There's another layer we have to acknowledge, and this one can feel uncomfortable. Most media outlets are businesses. They rely on viewership, subscriptions, ad revenue, and engagement. And engagement is closely tied to emotion. Stories that make us feel something, anger, fear, excitement, shock, are more likely to be clicked, shared, and discussed. That doesn't mean every newsroom sits around scheming about how to stir chaos, but it does mean there are economic incentives at play here. Calm, methodical explanations often don't travel as far as dramatic headlines. A detailed breakdown of policy language might be incredibly informative, but it's less likely to trend than a clip of two commentators arguing. We can even see this in ourselves. How often do we click on the headline that promises a strong reaction? How often do we scroll past the long, carefully researched article because we just don't have the time? In a world competing for our attention, stories that spark immediate emotion tend to rise to the top. And over time, that can create an environment where the loudest angles are the ones we encounter most frequently. It's not always about deception. Sometimes it's simply about survival in an attention economy. But when attention becomes currency, the way stories are packaged can shift in subtle ways. And then there's the digital layer. Most of us no longer consume news in one place at one set time each day. We encounter it through feeds that are personalized to us. Social media platforms use algorithms designed to show us content we're likely to engage with. The more we interact with a certain type of post, the more of that type we see. If we frequently click on articles that lean one direction politically, our feed starts to reflect that. If we watch videos criticizing a certain viewpoint, we're shown more of them. Over time, our online environment can start to feel like confirmation that our perspective is the obvious one. It's subtle. We're not usually aware that our information stream is being filtered. It just feels like we're staying informed. And to be fair, personalization isn't inherently bad. It can help surface content we genuinely care about, but it can also narrow the range of perspectives we're exposed to. When most of what we see reinforces what we already believe, it becomes harder to imagine that equally intelligent, well-meaning people might see the same event differently. The illusion of consensus grows stronger. And that brings us back to our earlier question. If stories are framed through language, influenced by economic incentives, and filtered through algorithms that learn our preferences, is pure neutrality even realistic? Or is the more realistic goal transparency, knowing that bias exists and learning how to account for it? Up to this point, it might feel like we've been circling around one big conclusion. Media has influence. It shapes tone, it frames stories, it competes for attention. Algorithms filter what we see, and all of that is true. But if we stop the conversation there, it becomes very easy to position ourselves as victims of a system. It becomes, the media did this to us, and while there are certainly powerful forces at work, that explanation lets us off the hook a little too comfortably. So let's make this harder. What if the media isn't the only one shaping our thinking? What if we are more involved in this process than we'd like to admit? So maybe media isn't the villain. It's almost comforting to believe that influence is something done to us. If something else is controlling the narrative, then we're just responding to it. We're reacting to what we've been shown. But the reality is more complicated. News, social clips, commentary, all that doesn't exist in a vacuum. It responds to demand. It adapts to audience behavior. It tracks what we click, what we share, what we comment on, and it keeps us watching. In other words, there's a feedback loop. And we're part of it. Think about how often we share an article after only reading the headline, or how quickly we comment on a clip without watching the full segment. Most of us have done it at some point, not because we're careless, but because we're reacting emotionally in real time. If something confirms what we already believe, we're more likely to accept it without digging further. If it challenges us, we may scroll past or look for a counter-argument instead of sitting with the discomfort. And when we share something, even casually, we become part of its amplification. We're not just consumers anymore, we're distributors. It's easy to criticize the media for spreading certain narratives, but those narratives often gain traction because millions of us interact with them. We click, we comment, we repost. Every interaction sends a signal, more of this, and the system responds accordingly. Algorithms are creepy like that. While it's true that the media influences us, it's also true that our behavior influences the media. We are willing participants in the system that keeps delivering us more and more filtered information by the minute. And let's be real, emotional content is compelling. Stories that make us angry or indignant tend to stick. We feel energized. We feel like we're standing up for something. We feel connected to others who share our reaction. Calmer, more measured discussions don't always create that same spark. A careful breakdown of complex issues requires time and patience. It asks us how to slow down, to consider competing perspectives, to tolerate a bit of uncertainty. That can feel exhausting. Outrage, on the other hand, feels immediate and clear. It gives us a sense of certainty. It simplifies complicated situations into heroes and villains. And because outrage is engaging, it spreads quickly. Not necessarily because someone orchestrated it, but because we respond to it. If we consistently reward dramatic angles with our attention, then dramatic angles will continue to rise to the top. If we rarely engage with long-form, thoughtful reporting, it's less likely to be prioritized. Think NPR. In our younger years, we made fun of NPR for their long-form stories that took forever to get to the point. Now, I personally love NPR, but it's not for everyone. In that sense, the media doesn't just shape us. It adapts to us, which can be a little uncomfortable to admit. It would be unfair and frankly inaccurate to reduce all media to manipulation and feedback loops. Investigative journalists uncover corruption. War correspondents risk their safety to report from dangerous places. Local reporters sit through city council meetings that most of us would never attend. The free press plays a crucial role in holding power accountable. Without it, many stories that affect our lives would never see the light of day. So this conversation isn't about dismissing journalism, it's about recognizing complexity. Media is made by people. People bring perspectives, assumptions, and limitations to their work. Businesses bring financial realities. Audiences bring preferences and attention patterns. All of those forces intersect, which means the relationship between the media and our thinking isn't one-sided. It's dynamic. It's interactive. It's shaped by structure and by choice. And that brings us back to something we touched on at the very beginning. If we hold a strong opinion about something, do we know where it came from? Did we seek out multiple sources? Did we look for missing context? Did we pause long enough to question our initial reaction? Or did we absorb a version that felt familiar and just move right along? Maybe the most honest answer is that we've all done a little bit of both. We've trusted responsibly at times, but reacted quickly at others. We've shared things we later realized were incomplete, but we've also learned and adjusted. The McDonald's case is just one example of how a simplified narrative can outlive the details. And it's easy to point backward at a story from 1994 and see how public perception was shaped. The harder work is looking at what's happening right now. What stories are we accepting at face value? What headlines are shaping our tone? What narratives feel obvious and why? Because maybe the real issue isn't whether the media controls how we think. Maybe it's whether we're aware of how influence works while it's happening, and whether we're willing to slow down long enough to notice it. The more I think about this, I don't think today's takeaway is that the media is secretly controlling us. And I don't think the answer is to walk away feeling like we can't trust anything we read or watch. If anything, this conversation just makes me want to pay attention a little bit more to what I hear and see, and question the intention behind it. Because it's surprisingly easy to feel like we understand something, especially when it's on repeat during a news cycle. And the McDonald's lawsuit is a good reminder of how a dishonest version of events can stick with us, just because we listened to what was loudest and moved on. But if we really want to make sure we're not letting the news or social media control the way we think, we need to be willing to examine everything we hear and see just a little bit more. We should consider the intent of the person behind the words, not just how the words themselves are packaged and presented, and dig deep to uncover their biases while trying to keep our own bias in check. We need to stay curious and let ourselves wonder if there's context we haven't heard yet. And we should be open to the idea that our first reaction to a clip or reel doesn't have to be our final one. We are allowed to change our minds as we learn new information. This kind of questioning doesn't make us cynical. It makes us thoughtfully aware of the world around us and protects us from information that might seek to harm us. Shouldn't we all be pursuing that anyway? As always, I hope this episode gave you something to noodle on. I personally don't like thinking that media has an agenda, but at the end of the day, they want to push views, so I get it. For this week, I'd like for you to think about something you saw in the media and how it shaped your perception on the topic. Tell us on Discord or social media at A Pod to Noodle On. Until next time, bye!